Essen, Germany, November 29, 1971. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit walks out of a grocery warehouse headquarters completely alone. No bodyguard, no driver, no security detail of any kind. Just a man and his car in an empty parking lot. That man is worth 2 billion Deutschmarks, and 2 people are waiting for him in the dark. Here's what makes this story insane. The man being kidnapped that night was one of the wealthiest people on the planet, the co-founder of Aldi, a billionaire so secretive, so reclusive, that most Germans had never even seen his face. And yet, he was walking to his car alone in the dark because he was too frugal to hire a driver. And the 2 men waiting for him? One was a failed lawyer drowning in gambling debts. The other was a safecracker who dreamed of building a beach house in Spain. Together, they pulled off the largest ransom kidnapping in European history, 7 million Deutschmarks, and they almost got away with it. This is the story nobody talks about, the forgotten kidnapping of the Aldi billionaire. Let's start from the beginning, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Theo Albrecht actually was. Theo was born in 1922 in Essen, Germany. His father was a coal miner who eventually developed lung disease from working underground. His mother, Anna, opened a small grocery store in 1913 to keep the family afloat. It was a tiny operation. Customers couldn't even browse the shelves themselves. You'd walk in, tell the staff what you needed, and pay your bill at the end of the month on a tab. No self-service, no impulse buying, just essentials. Theo grew up sweeping those floors, stacking those shelves, learning every inch of that business. Then World War II happened. At 18 years old, he was conscripted into the German army and sent to North Africa. He fought in Tunisia, was captured by Allied forces, and spent years as a prisoner of war. His brother Karl was wounded in combat. By the time they both returned to a bombed-out Germany in 1946, everything was rubble. But their mother's store was still standing. The 2 brothers took it over, and what followed was one of the greatest business stories of the 20th century. They introduced loss leaders, selling staples like butter below cost just to pull customers through the door in a cash-starved post-war economy. They opened Germany's first self-service grocery store in 1954. By 1960, 300 stores. They called it Aldi Discount, which eventually became a 2-syllable word the whole world would know, Aldi. Then the brothers split. Not dramatically, not over something you'd expect from a business divorce of this scale. They split because of cigarettes. Karl wanted to sell them. Theo didn't. So in 1960, they divided the empire cleanly down the middle of Germany. Theo took the north, Karl took the south. 2 separate companies, 2 separate billionaires, one shared obsession with keeping costs brutally low. By 1971, Theo's Aldi Nord had annual revenues of around 2 billion Deutschmarks. He was one of the richest men in Europe, and nobody knew what he looked like. He wore cheap suits that didn't fit. He drove an ordinary car. He used pencils until they were stubs too short to hold. Now, let's talk about the 2 men who decided to kidnap him. Heinz Joachim Eulenberg was born around 1924. He was a Dusseldorf lawyer, or at least he played one. He had faked his high school diploma to gain admission to law school, somehow passed the bar on appeal, and opened a firm that specialized in exactly the kind of clientele you'd expect from a man who started his career with forged documents. Loan sharks, small-time criminals, burglars, people nobody else would represent. He threw lavish parties in Essen and Dusseldorf, surrounded himself with celebrities, pursued a string of younger women, including a 19-year-old legal assistant and a woman named Hanna, who came from a wealthy family and lent him 300,000 Deutschmarks. He owed debts totaling around 700,000 DM. Gambling, loans, clients whose money he had quietly pocketed over the years. One job in particular, a department store burglary in Dusseldorf in 1964, had netted over 500,000 marks. Eulenberg had kept most of it, sent his accomplice to Spain to lie low, then taken out loans in that same accomplice's name while he was gone. That accomplice was Paul Kron. Paul Kron, nicknamed Diamond Paul, Diamond Paul, was born around 1930. He was a mechanic during the day, earning less than 2,000 marks a month. At night, he broke into banks and jewelers using a stethoscope pressed against safe doors, listening to the tumbling mechanisms the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. He had 58 convictions. 58. Banks, vaults, department stores, jewelry shops. He'd been in and out of prison his entire adult life. He'd been orphaned young, raised in an orphanage, dealt with chronic spinal problems from childhood. His dream was simple. He owned a piece of land along the Spanish Mediterranean coast and wanted to build a house there. He called it Casa Poo. That was it. That was the dream. A beach house. And Allenberg had stolen every haul he'd ever earned. By 1971, Kron was reportedly threatening Allenberg, telling him he'd be pumped away if the debts weren't settled. Allenberg, cornered, desperate, with a 19-year-old girlfriend he was planning to flee to Cuba with, started reading. He read a book called The Rich and Super Rich in Germany. He read articles in Spiegel, in Zeit, in Handelsblatt. One name kept appearing at the top of every wealth list: Albrecht, the Aldi brothers.
The plan took shape. They initially considered Karl Albrecht, the southern brother. But Karl was better guarded, more cautious, harder to reach. Theo was different. Theo walked to his car alone every evening from Aldi Nord headquarters in Herten near Reckelheisen. No bodyguard, no driver, just a man and a parking lot. Kron bought pistols through contacts in Spain. They surveilled the Aldi Nord headquarters multiple times. They drove past it, they watched the exits, they almost did it several times and stopped. And then on November 28, 1971, the day before they finally went through with it, they did something that sounds completely unbelievable. They called Theo's wife. Silly Albrecht answered the phone at the family home in Essen and heard a man's voice tell her calmly that tomorrow they were going to kidnap her husband. Don't call the police, don't try to stop it, follow the demands and everything would be fine. She agreed, and she said nothing to anyone. November 29, 1971, evening. Theo Albrecht, 49 years old, walked out of Aldi Nord headquarters last. Everyone else had already gone home. He crossed the parking lot toward his gray Mercedes 280 SE, probably thinking about something mundane, a shipment, a margin calculation, something with pencils. Allenberg and Kron stepped out of the shadows with pistols. They pointed the guns at him and then did something that tells you everything about how prepared they were for this moment. They asked him to show ID. Are you really Theo Albrecht? Because the man in front of them looked like nobody. Cheap suit, ordinary shoes, no jewelry, no watch worth noting. He looked like the bookkeeper. He showed him his identification. It was him. They forced him into the back seat of his own Mercedes, covered his eyes, and drove toward Dusseldorf. At some point during the drive, they passed through an intersection where Karl Albrecht happened to be sitting in his own car on the other side of a stop sign. Karl didn't notice. He drove away. His brother was in a car 10 feet from him, a gun pressed against his ribs, and Karl just drove away. They arrived at Allenberg's law office in central Dusseldorf. They'd cleared the staff. They guided Theo, blindfolded, through the busy streets around the building, then up and inside. They put him in a small room, a 4-square-meter alcove off the main office space. It had a bed, a desk, access to a bathroom with a double sink. The walls were thick enough. There was no window. They locked the door. Around midnight, they called Silly again. "We have your husband. No police, no press. You'll hear from us." Here's where it gets strange. For the next several days, nothing happened. No ransom demand, no timeline, no instructions, just silence. Theo sat in that small room listening to streetcars rattling past outside and church bells marking the hours. He could hear the city, but couldn't see it. Allenberg and Kron, it turned out, had planned the abduction in detail and the aftermath almost not at all. They'd bought a carpet to roll him in, which was too small. His head stuck out one end and his feet out the other. They'd had to abandon that idea entirely. Theo was fed reasonably well, steak, potatoes, but the captivity had its own particular misery. He was 59 days away from Christmas. He had no idea if his family thought he was alive. And he was sharing a confined space with 2 increasingly nervous men who owed each other money and hated each other. Around day 5, Theo Albrecht did what Theo Albrecht did his entire life. He tried to negotiate. "I am worth 2 billion Deutschmarks," he reportedly told them. "I have built a grocery empire. Let me negotiate my own release." He started at 100,000 DM. The kidnappers laughed. They wanted 7 million, Europe's largest ransom in history. Silly had finally contacted Theo's brother Carl, who told the police. It took the family 2 days to make that call, fearing what disclosure would do. The police assembled a commission of 70 to over 160 investigators, Germany's first large-scale kidnapping response. Wiretaps were installed on the family's phones. A ransom negotiation began. The calls went back and forth. Letters were exchanged. Carl primarily handled the phone calls while police listened. An early miscalculation nearly ended everything when police arranged an undercover officer to pose as a family representative, and the kidnappers smelled something wrong and went silent for days. Trust had to be rebuilt from scratch. Theo, meanwhile, had smuggled out a note to his captors, something to the effect of, "This is how business is done. Let's talk." The ransom was set at 7 million Deutschmarks. The family began assembling the cash. When the bank received the withdrawal request for that sum, the flags went up. The press got wind of something. Lawyers warned Eulenburg. He was furious, but still needed the money.
A solution appeared from an unlikely direction. Bishop Franz Hengsbach, the Bishop of Essen. He was Theo's confessor, a man bound by the seal of the confessional and trusted completely by the family. The kidnappers, Catholic themselves, agreed. The bishop would make the drop. No police involvement at the handover. In exchange, Theo would stay with the bishop for 24 hours after release, giving the kidnappers time to disappear. December 16, 1971. Night. A cold, dark dirt road near Breitscheid, on the outskirts of Dusseldorf. 2 escape routes in case of a trap. Theo Albrecht sat in a car with Eulenburg and Kron, wearing a dry-cleaned suit, skin patches over his eyes, borrowed sunglasses, and someone else's hat. They had shared a bottle of sparkling wine on the drive, the 3 of them, which is a detail that somehow makes the whole thing more surreal. Kidnappers and kidnapped, sharing a drink before the handoff. They waited over an hour, paranoid, watching for police cars, listening for helicopter rotors. Then headlights appeared. Bishop Hengsbach and his driver, both in clerical coats, carrying 2 suitcases that looked like Christmas gifts, because that's how they'd been wrapped. 7 million Deutschmarks in 500 and 1,000 mark notes. Before handing over the money, the bishop had to verify he was actually talking to Theo. He asked 3 questions. First, a few weeks ago you received a new armoire. What kind of wood was it? Theo guessed mahogany. He was wrong. Second, what is your wife's name? Silly. Correct. Third, a question about a mutual acquaintance or vacation, something only Theo would know. Close enough. 2 out of 3. The bishop handed over the suitcases. The kidnappers said Merry Christmas and drove away into the dark. Bishop Hengsbach drove Theo home. When Theo walked through the door and Silly embraced him, she found duct tape residue around his eyes. Pulling it off took his eyelashes with it. The next morning, Theo told reporters one thing. "I am of course very tired. It was a very exhausting business." And that was it. The last public statement he ever made. The last time he stood in front of cameras. After that, Theo Albrecht simply vanished from public life. That one sentence at the door, exhausted and blinking, was his farewell to the world. The police, meanwhile, had been handed one of the most extraordinary investigative gifts in German criminal history, the ransom call recordings. Voices, real, identifiable human voices that had been broadcast over the phone to a wire-tapped line. They put those recordings on national television, on radio, ARD, ZDF, every major channel. And almost immediately, the calls started coming in. Paul Kron's sister was sitting at home watching television when she heard the voice come out of the screen. She recognized it instantly. She called the police. "That's Paulie, that's my brother." The same day, an electronics store owner in Dusseldorf called in a tip. A man had come in recently and bought a stereo system worth 3,400 Deutschmarks, paid in 500 DM notes. The owner had noted the serial numbers at the time, a common precaution for large cash transactions. The police ran those numbers. They matched the ransom bills. Paul Kron was arrested at his parents' house that same day, December 18, 1971. Theo's detailed descriptions of his captivity did the rest. He described the sounds he'd heard, the layout of the bathroom, the double sink, the specific arrangement of the room. Police obtained a search warrant, matched the description to Ohlenberg's law office exactly, and found physical evidence including Theo's DNA in the Mercedes. Ohlenberg, meanwhile, had already fled. He told his girlfriend, Hannah, he was going on a team-building retreat. He was actually on his way to Mexico City with his 19-year-old legal assistant, planning to eventually make it to Cuba. Hannah, not knowing any of this yet, handed police one critical item, a pair of Ohlenberg's trousers, caked with mud. Forensics found traces matching the Bright Shy drop site. Ohlenberg was located in Mexico, extradited, and brought back to Germany. Kron's accomplice, a friend who had helped with logistics, was also arrested. Evidence found at his home connected him to the conspiracy. The trial came in 1973 at Essen's Superior Court. The prosecution demanded 12 years. The judge sentenced both Ohlenberg and Kron to 8.5 years each. During proceedings, the two men reportedly laughed about their financial dispute, each blaming the other for the missing money. Because here was the final twist of the whole affair. Of the 7 million Deutschmarks, only approximately 3.5 million was ever recovered. Ohlenberg had returned his half after his arrest, he claimed. The other 3.5 million was gone. Kron said he'd only ever received 10,000 marks from Ohlenberg. He was cleverer than me, Kron said in an interview years later. Prosecutors believed Ohlenberg had hidden the rest, possibly in Switzerland. Nobody ever proved it. Rumors of a Swiss bank account followed him for the rest of his life. And then, life moved on in the way that only life can.
Theo Albrecht went back to work at Aldi the very next day after his release. He drove to the office in an armored car. He took a different route every single morning. The family built a highly secured estate overlooking the Ruhr Valley. Theo never appeared in public again. The only photo taken of him after the kidnapping was a single image captured the day he came home. The only other photograph of the two brothers together was taken in 1987 by a journalist named Franz Ruck, who somehow got access. In an era before social media, before smartphones, before the internet, a man who was 31st on the Forbes list of the world's richest people managed to be almost completely invisible for 40 years. In 1979, Theo bought Trader Joe's, applying the same stripped-down, private-label, low-price model that had built Aldi. He also filed something with the Münster Finance Court that year, which tells you everything you need to know about the man. He tried to deduct the 7 million mark ransom as a business expense. His argument was legally coherent, actually. He was Aldi Nord's chief executive. His kidnapping was a direct result of his business position. The ransom protected the company's leadership. Therefore, business expense, tax deductible under German income tax law. The court said no. They ruled the kidnapping was primarily a private matter, a mixed personal and business event, and couldn't be fully deducted. However, they did allow the unrecovered 3.5 million marks to be claimed as an extraordinary personal burden, a partial victory. Classic Theo, finding a way to claw something back from a total loss. He died on July 24, 2010, in Essen. He was 88 years old. His net worth was $16.7 billion. Forbes ranked him the 31st richest person in the world. He had not made a public statement since the morning after his kidnapping. He had not voluntarily appeared in a photograph in nearly 4 decades. His brother Carl died 4 years later, in 2014. Paul Kron died in January 2017 in an elderly care home, living on a state pension. In his last interview with Bild, he said he genuinely did not know where the missing money was. "I only got 10,000 Deutschmarks from Ohlenberg," he said. "He was cleverer than me." Heinz Joachim Ohlenberg died 1 month later, in February 2017, 93 years old. He had refused every interview request for decades, living quietly near the Polish border, telling no one anything. The mystery of the missing 3.5 million Deutschmarks died with him. Then, in 2025, the Essen Police Department's cold case unit was clearing out a basement storage area when they found something. A box. More than 1 carton of original investigative files from the 1971 kidnapping, documents that had never been fully reviewed, never digitized, sitting in a basement for 50 years. Investigators are going through them now, looking for anything that might finally explain where that money went. They probably won't find it. Ohlenberg was too careful, too patient. a man who forged his high school diploma, talked his way through a bar exam, and ran a law practice for decades while embezzling from clients, and vanished to Mexico with cash in a suitcase, doesn't leave a paper trail in a box in a basement. But here's what the whole story leaves you with. Two desperate, amateurish men with pistols and a carpet that was too small somehow pulled off the largest ransom kidnapping in European history. They held one of the world's wealthiest men in a 4-square-meter closet for 17 days while he negotiated his own release, like he was approving a bulk order for toilet paper. The money was delivered by a bishop in a clerical coat carrying Christmas-wrapped suitcases on a dark dirt road outside Dusseldorf. And the whole thing unraveled because a man bought a stereo system and paid cash, and his safecracker accomplice forgot to disguise his voice on a phone call that got broadcast to the entire country. Half the money was never found. The man who took it lived to 93. The man who lost everything in it died on a state pension. And the billionaire they kidnapped spent the last 40 years of his life invisible, frugal to the end, still collecting pencil stubs too short to hold, still wearing suits that didn't fit, still the richest man in the room that nobody could pick out of a crowd. Theo Albrecht never stopped being exactly who he was. He just stopped letting anyone watch.